Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be taking a look at the ASUS Tuf Gaming Wi-Fi Plus Mark II. This is a slightly upgraded version of the original Plus Wi-Fi, and there are a few small improvements on this particular board. Now let's not get excited, there aren't a huge lot of differences. One of the main key things is going to be the fact that this is ready to use any AM4 processor directly out of the box. So that is something to be well, taking into consideration, if you're somewhat of a novice builder and you're not too sure about doing the whole BIOS flashback thing, of which this does have a BIOS flashback button, so it is pretty easy to do. But if you don't want to have those kind of worries or concerns, you can buy this board and it will work with every single AM4 processor on the market, well, at least the ones that the B550 chipset supports. So unfortunately, Ryzen 1000 series and 2000 series are not supported, and neither is the 3400G, 3200G, and all those derivatives of the 2000 series with integrated graphics. Some of the key features of this board: got a 10-phase VRM split into 8+2 configuration. You also got some extended heatsinks as well around that VRM area, and also two M.2 slots, one of which PCI Express Gen 4 ×4 speed, and the one at the bottom there, PCI Express Gen 3 ×4. Also support up to 128GB of RAM, lots of RGB outputs. So overall, a very nice, attractive package, and especially if it's at the right price. Now, I was really lucky. I managed to pick this up as a deal for around about £120. The price on this does seem to fluctuate, and if you go over to ASUS's site, you'll see the price is absolutely insane, around about £190, which, yeah, you should never pay. But if you can pick one of these up for somewhere between £100 and £140, I think you're going to be doing pretty well. So in today's video, we're going to go through, do an unboxing, show you what you get, go through a tour of the motherboard, all of the ports, etc. And then we'll wrap things up at the end with my final thoughts and recommendations. Taking a very quick look at the packaging, so pretty much tells you the whole deal here, so the motherboard name, etc. Does support ASUS Aurora Sync and also addressable RGB Gen 2 headers. As you can see, B550 chipset, this is the Tuf Gaming Plus Wi-Fi 2. And this is all the things that are supported down the bottom. Some of the key ones, I suppose, are going to be DTS, also Wi-Fi 6, also supports Bluetooth 5.2 as well, and supports Windows 11 straight out of the box. On the back of the box, it goes through an exploded view, breaking down all the individual features, but don't worry, we'll go through those now. For those of you interested to know what you actually get inside the packaging, so let's break that down for you. So there is the ASUS Wi-Fi antenna, so this supports up to Wi-Fi 6 standards. There is also a I/O shield, unfortunately not a captive one on this particular board. That was a very common thing with the ASUS Tuf range, even up to the X570 boards, still had a removable I/O shield. Make sure you don't lose it. Quite a handy thing on these, it does actually tell you which one of the ports on the back is for USB flashing, and also which one is the BIOS flashback button. You also get two SATA cables. There's some sticky pads to be used with single-sided M.2 drives. There are a pair of M.2 risers and screws, a ASUS Tuf driver disc, a certificate of reliability, some funky stickers to put on your motherboard or your PC case, a detailed user manual, and some regulatory notices. Okay, so you've had the potatoes and vegetables, let's get into the meat of this thing. So looking at the motherboard in the top corner, we've got an 8-pin EPS connector there, just a single 8-pin, no need for additional power. This board is absolutely fine with 8 pins and will use up to a 5950X processor should you wish to, or a 5800X3D. That is fully supported straight out of the box, and the VRM should cope with that quite nicely. Talking of the VRMs, you've got these really nice heat sinks. I've taken those off as well, so let's give you some nude shots of the board. As you can see, it's all laid out very nicely and gives you a clearer idea of what is going on underneath the heat sinks there. The heat sinks are easily removable, so if you want to upgrade the thermal pads, you certainly can do at some point. Over the lifetime of pads, they do deteriorate, so potentially a refresh after a year or two might be a good idea. In the center, obviously, you've got your AM4 socket and the standard AM4 retention brackets. In this top section here, got some outputs for fans. So actually something which I've noticed on ASUS boards, and I've never noticed this before, so this is somewhat of a revelation to me, so hold on to your hats. I've realized that on this particular type of board, the gray ports are the primary ones, which it never dawned to me before, but the grey ports are primary. So to go through, the PCI Express slot at the top there, grey, primary slot. Memory slots, grey ones, those are your primary channels. And when it comes to the fan headers, that's the grey one, so that is your primary connection. If you want to have a CPU cooler like a Freezer 34, it has two fans basically, so if you want to plug in both, there is an optional CPU fan header next to it. That can be configured also in the BIOS, and also can be used for things like an AIO, that sort of thing. We are doing videos on the ASUS setup, how all this works in Fan Expert. I'll try and link that video below, so if you've got any questions about that, you can find out more there. Moving across, there is a 12-volt RGB header on the top, and we've got our 4 RAM slots, primary ones coloured in grey. This supports up to 128 gigabytes of RAM, should you wish to. Depending on the processor you're using, the same normally applies, so if you're going with the very fastest RAM this supports, which at present seems to be 4866 megatransfers per second, if you populate all 4 slots, potentially you may not get those stellar speeds, so do bear that in mind. Moving down, this is one of the things which is potentially going to be a lifesaver for a lot of people. Now clearly, if your system doesn't boot up on the first attempt, you're going to be thinking, well, what the heck's going on? It doesn't need a BIOS update because it supports basically everything. What's the deal? So you have a LED there, which is a diagnostic. So if the CPU lights on, it means your CPU is not recognized. If the RAM lights on, RAM possibly isn't recognized, VGA, boot, etc, etc. So very handy diagnostic LEDs, very useful indeed. Underneath that, 24-pin power connector, nothing out of the ordinary there. USB 3.0 front panel connector, something which is missing on here, which I would have liked to have seen, which unfortunately you probably could add later on if you want to for a slight outlay. There is no USB Type-C header for front panel connection. You can get a PCI card which will fit into one of these slots, so if you do want to add it, you can do that. We've actually done a video on that, I'll link that in the video as well. So if you have this board and you want to add USB Type-C front panel connectors, you can do very easily, and it's actually quite cost effective. So carry on down the side, so we've got 6 SATA ports. Now there is a little bit of a issue with these potentially. If you're using the bottom M.2 slot, that actually shares bandwidth through the PCI Express lanes with the bottom 2 connectors. So if you have drives connected on SATA 5 or SATA 6, and you then install a M.2 drive in this bottom slot, the M.2 drive will take precedence, so those drives will no longer function. Obviously, choose whichever you want to do. Moving slightly across there, we've got a heatsink there over our B550 chipset to keep things nice and cool. The B550 chipset sips power, so it doesn't need any active cooling, so this is going to be absolutely fine. At this point, we should move across a little bit. So this is our PCI Express Gen 4 x 4 M.2 slot. This only supports NVMe drives, no SATA drives, and the same goes for this bottom slot as well. Really, these days, pretty much all the drives on the market in the M.2s are NVMe rather than the older SATA SSD type ones, so you shouldn't have any problems there. But if you do have an old drive lying around, you stick it in, you wonder why it doesn't work, then that's possibly why. Just to the side of that, there is an AIO header, and also there is a chassis fan header. So if you do want to connect up fans at the back, you can do. The AIO one, traditionally on a lot of boards, tends to be towards the top because you normally have your pump and all that kind of wiring pushed out the top, but for some reason they've got it down there on this particular board. Next to that, there is a TPM header, so if you want to add your own TPM, you can do, although AM4 processors generally all have the FTPM built in. There is a heatsink on there. It's nothing too elaborate, but it will get the job done. There's also a thermal pad on there as well, so if you do want to dissipate the heat from your M.2 drives, you can do. Don't forget, if you're using a single-sided drive, make sure you put the additional pad on just to increase the height of the support beneath it. Underneath that, PCI Express Gen 4 x 16 slot, so full speed for your PCI Express system there. It also has a slightly enhanced clip there with a little bit of metal in it to stop it breaking off. Not quite as good as I'd like. I'd like these to be a little bit bigger, a little bit more flared. I have actually managed to break one of these on my previous X570 Tuf board. That was stabbed with a screwdriver, so obviously if you're careful, that won't happen to you, but yeah, I would have preferred to have seen something a little bit better for that mechanism. Moving down, we've got all of our PCI Express slots here. So these are all PCI Express Gen 3, all of which coming from the B550 chipset. So this top one here is PCI Express Gen 3 x 1. This is a PCI Express Gen 3 x 16 size slot, but only wired for ×4 speeds. If you install any other cards in any other of the PCI Express ×1 slots, this slot automatically will reduce down to PCI Express Gen 3 x 1 speeds. So you don't drop down from PCI Express Gen 3 x 4 to ×2. It does go straight down to ×1. So the extra ports on there do take up the bandwidth, all of which PCI Express Gen 3 x 1. We've already discussed it, but I'll mention it again. So at the bottom there, PCI Express Gen 3 x 4 slot for your M.2 drives. Exactly the same heatsink. Those two are actually interchangeable, so if you want to swap them around or if you lose one, you can swap them around. A lot of drives these days come with their own actual heatsink, so if you do want to use your own, you can do. The board looks absolutely fine without them attached. The choice is yours. Now let's take a look at the I/O and the connectivity at the bottom. So in this corner, we've got our front panel I/O, so your reset switch, power button, all those kinds of things. Next to that, there is a fan header, PWM fan header. Next to that, two USB 2.0 ports, another fan header. Then we have a thermal sensor and also the clear CMOS. Next to that, three RGB sections, two of which addressable, supporting Gen 2. And then we've also got a 12 volt RGB also. Next to that, there is a COM port, so a debug port above that as well. Next to that, if you want to add on an additional Thunderbolt port, you can do. There's a header for that. And last of all, you have a front panel header for the onboard audio. At the very end there, we've got our onboard audio. So that is the realtek S1200 chipset. ASUS like to put a little cover on the top, like a heatsink with the Tuf logo on, which I think looks very nice. Speaking of the audio, quite a nice setup on here. Supports 7.1 and also you do have optical SPDIF as well. So now let's take a look at the rear I/O. So we'll start from this top section. So we have a BIOS flashback button, although I think on this particular system it's probably kind of pointless because as things stand at the moment, there isn't a processor due out on AM4 socket, which this doesn't support. So maybe if you corrupt your BIOS somehow, maybe an electrical storm or something like that, then yeah, you have got it there should you need to. Potentially you might want to update it just for things like security patches, which will still be coming out, but in terms of actual processor, then you don't really need it for that. But we'll do a video on that as well so you can see how all that works. So moving across from that, so you've got two USB 2.0 ports, of which the bottom one of those two is actually for doing your BIOS flashback. People always ask, that port will be fine in Windows or whatever operating system you choose, or even DOS. They will act as a normal USB port when you're not using it as a flashback port. Underneath that, USB 3.2 Gen 1, two ports there. Next to that, you've got the fastest ports on the board. So these are USB 3.2 Gen 2, Type A and Type C. Next to that, another two USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports. Above that, we've got our realtek LAN. So this is actually supporting 2.5 gigabit LAN, which actually for the B550 chipset isn't always that common, but it is starting to make somewhat of a breakthrough with switches and hubs being cheaper now. So that is useful. It does also support gigabit and backwards compatible with 10100 also. Next up, you've got your HDMI and a display port. So if you're using a integrated graphics GPU on here, an APU, such as some of the 4000 series or 5000 series, you can use those as outputs. Next up, we've got our Wi-Fi, so Wi-Fi 6 supported, two SMA connectors, so the antenna is included in the box as well. And last of all, we've got our audio outputs for that realtek S1200 chipset, all color coded, and also there is a optical SPDIF. So there you go. There is the ASUS B550 Tuf Gaming Plus Wi-Fi 2. This is going to be a pretty decent board, I feel, and especially for builders out there which are really not happy about the compatibility issues and kind of that guessing, is my motherboard going to be ready to go out of the box? Am I going to need to flash it? I think this is going to be one of those that takes that worry away. So potentially if it is even just slightly more expensive than possibly some of the other boards on the market, it might be worth it just for that peace of mind, especially if you're not that competent a builder. For everybody else, I think this is, again, very competent board, decent VRM setup, aesthetically very pleasing, and if you're into the whole ASUS Tuf ecosystem, then you're definitely going to find this right up your street. And also, don't forget, grey is your primary colour, so if you're installing your RAM, grey slots, GPU in the grey slots, and CPU cooling in the grey port. I'm glad I've worked it out finally. It's only taken me, what, 4 years, and I've finally figured that out. We learn something new every day, or at least I do. And hopefully you did as well. And if you've enjoyed this video, smash the like button. If you want to see more content like this on a daily basis, then hit the subscribe button and the chime button, and you'll see content in your inbox on a daily basis. But let me know, what do you think about this one? I'm pretty stoked about it. If you can pick it up at the right price, again, round about somewhere between 100 and 140 pounds, depending when obviously you're watching this video. At the moment here in the UK, November 2023, prices are still kind of weird. The older AM4 stuff is still holding its price, and the newer AM5 stuff is actually coming down and kind of meeting it, which is kind of weird, being that AM5 is considerably higher spec in general. But anyway, there you go. That's been the ASUS Tuf Gaming Plus Wi-Fi Mark II. I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.